practicing. So we were visiting this restaurant. We were waiting in the front of the restaurant, and these two young guys, they came by and they saw us, and they exclaimed, they said, "Look at these Shaolin monks. They must be practicing Kung Fu." And so they asked us, "Do you actually practice Kung Fu?" And I thought for a moment, and I said, "Yes, we practice Kung Fu." And then they said, "This is cool, man, this is cool. What kind of Kung Fu do you practice?" And I said, "We practice an internal kind of Kung Fu." And then we had a chance to share about our practice. In Buddhism, and particularly in the Vietnamese language, when we speak about our practice, we speak about Kung Fu, or in Vietnamese language, Gong Fu. The morning practice is called Gong Fu, and the evening practice is also called Gong Fu. And many years ago in Plum Village, our teacher was inviting us, in addition to engaging fully in this Gong Fu practice in the morning and in the evening and throughout the day, for each of us to have a little book that we would note down whenever we would experience a practice, such as walking meditation or sitting meditation or eating meditation, any of those practices throughout the day, that we would note down how we did in what he called our Kung Fu notebook. And it was a great practice to go through each day and consider how we experienced each of these practices, how we, whether we felt it was nourishing, whether we felt it was challenging, what worked well, what didn't work well. And I noticed for myself that I began to see some patterns. This was a way of identifying some of my weaknesses, some of my tendencies, and also some of my strengths in terms of the practice. And I really recommend it to each of my friends as well, to have a little book that we mark a page for each day, and we just list down the practices or the experiences that we have through the day and how we actually encounter them and experience them. And I guarantee you, after even a week, you'll start to see some of the patterns that you have. It can be a very enjoyable and insightful thing to do. I remember when I was a young monk, whenever I would suffer, I would practice super seriously. One day, I'll never forget this. I was doing super slow walking meditation around Upper Hamlet of Plum Village, and Tayak Tan, who was a very elder brother, who was really a Zen master. He saw me walking around, and when he saw me, he called out, "What's wrong with you? What's wrong, Brother Hohai?" And so in that moment, I realized what he was actually trying to teach me. And that was that it was only when I was experiencing some difficulty that I would be practicing, so seriously, so wholeheartedly. But what I really needed to do was to bring that energy to each and every moment of my life. When we practice in that way, it's something that we do rather than something that we are. We want our practice to be our way of being, not something that we do or that we focus on only when things are tough. That's the difference, the fundamental difference between mindfulness as a path and mindfulness as a technique. There's the beautiful verse of the practice of recollecting the Dharma that we find often in the texts. It says, "The Dharma is well taught by the awakened one, to be seen right here and right now. It's timeless. It's inviting direct verification by each person, relevant, to be realized by the wise for themselves." In this verse on the recollection of the Dhamma, we chant that the Dhamma, the ultimate truth of things, is directly visible. It's timeless. It's calling out to be approached and to be seen. It's always available to us. And that the place where it is to be realized, where the Dharma is to be realized, is within ourselves, within each one of us. The truth of the way things are has to be experienced by each one of us directly, and not just accepted on faith, or read in books or heard from a teacher or thought out logically, but experienced. We know for ourselves through insight, through seeing from within. The Dharma, or happiness or liberation, is not something mysterious, not something remote, but the Buddhist view, or the view of the Buddha, is that it's the truth at the core of our experience. It's the truth at the core of each one of our experiences, every moment. We touch the Dharma by looking, or having the willingness and the capacity to look at our lived experience with clear view. By focusing our energy of mindfulness to penetrate through the surface layers, right through to the foundation, in each and every moment. And then we crack the foundation into 1,000 pieces. This happens not only one time, but over and over again. The quality that helps us focus on our experience and generate this beautiful quality of insight, of seeing from within, is a quality or a mental faculty that in Pali we call sati. It's usually translated in English as mindfulness, or sometimes recollection. Mindfulness is a relaxed attentiveness and presence of mind. The awareness involved in the liberating faculty of mindfulness, or mindfulness as a factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, is quite different from the kind of awareness that we tend to have operating on the usual level of mind consciousness. All consciousness involves awareness in some way, in a sense of knowing or experiencing an object. But with the practice of right mindfulness, our mind is trained to recognize and to remain at the level of bare attention. As we cultivate the practice of right mindfulness, we train our mind to remain rooted in the present, paying attention to whatever is happening. If any interpretations, stories, or judgments arise, we note them and we let them go. Believe it or not, mindfulness is an innate capacity that we all have. And at the same time, it's quite subtle. Over time, we become more aware of the processes of our mind. But usually, despite our best intentions, our mind runs away from us. When a sense impression occurs, a sound, a sight, a taste, a touch, a smell, and so on, rather than just staying with it, how interesting. The tendency of our mind is to use the impression as a springboard for creating mental formations. This process is almost always full of interpretation, full of assumptions or conceptualization. In fact, most of the time, the initial object of our attention, the sight, the sound, the smell, the taste, the touch, and so on, is only seen vaguely, like the sun through the clouds, because we're already off on this whole cycle of interpretation and assumptions and conceptualization. There are ways, quite sophisticated ways, that our mind manipulates experience. Mindfulness unties these knots by mere recognition, by simply noting. In the past, I've used a very non-technical term for this tendency of our mind to get caught up in assumptions and conceptualization. I usually refer to it as the stories we tell ourselves about something. I think it's easy to remember and to relate to. In fact, to relate to that phrase, the stories we tell ourselves, is a lot more easy than the technical term. I remember somebody saying to me one time, "You're just making this up, Brother Fabhai." But actually, see, because I was not using the technical term when I was speaking about it or when I was writing about it. In the text, as you can imagine, we find a much more technical term. In Pali, it's papancha. It means elaboration, embellishment, or conceptual proliferation. I have a feeling that if I had have referred to this process as conceptual proliferation, then there would have been many more people asleep in my talks than there usually are. These constant interpretations or proliferations let us know the object only at a distance, not as it really is. And as meditators, I don't know about you, but fundamentally, I'd like to be able to cultivate the capacity to see things as they really are, not as I am. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. In the beginning of the talk, we had just a little issue with the sound, and in the back of my mind, I was thinking it would actually be quite a wonderful experiment to see what interpretations people would make of that experience. Our practice is to be okay with things as they are, and so I was thinking it might be quite interesting to see what stories people tell themselves. And it might even be great to have a whole Dharma talk where there's no sound. It might even be a really powerful Dharma talk. Often we interpret all kinds of things in our daily lives. We tell ourselves so many stories about every single thing. And mindfulness will help us to be able to see these things much more clearly, to be able to identify the difference between the bare experience and the interpretation about it, which we generally tend to call reality, but is not reality at all. Mindfulness has a quality of bare attention, but also a quality of clear comprehension, of seeing things for what they are. Last night we had a mindfulness trainings transmission for the Compassionate Ocean Sangha. It was such a joyful occasion. We had over 50 people taking the 5 mindfulness trainings or renewing the 5 mindfulness trainings. And I found it quite amusing that at the beginning of the video that we recorded of that beautiful ceremony, the way that Zoom operated, the video begins with just the name of one of the participants that's on the screen. The person's name is Lila, I think. And so there was a whole thread about people saying, this must be Brother Phapai's way of teaching because Lila means pastime or it means joke or playfulness. And so for me, this was a perfect example of proliferation, conceptual proliferation, seeing something but then telling ourselves a story about it. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, it's quite nice. It's something that I'm kind of used to, and we become used to as Dharma teachers, that we might scratch our face and it becomes a teaching. But it's also helpful to be able to recognize the difference between simply observing something and interpreting it. To notice when we're doing either. One of the key tasks of right mindfulness is to help us to recognize and to transform these cognitive distortions. To practice mindfulness is not so much a matter of doing, but of undoing. And this is so contrary to our usual way of approaching things. And one of the very first fruits of mindfulness is meeting ourselves where we're at, wherever we find ourselves. And so mindfulness, it's important to understand, is not a technique, a set of things just to do, but it's a path, it's an unfolding. It's quite tempting to say that mindfulness is a path of not thinking, not judging, not interpreting, not imagining, and so on. This is the big temptation. But rather than that, mindfulness is a path of recognizing and transforming our thinking, our judging, our interpreting, our imagining, and so on, by examining the roots of these things, how they came to be, and how they arise within us. Mindfulness helps us to simply recognize things as they arise, as they remain for a while, and as they pass away. In the Visuddhimagga, which is quite a complete meditation text by Buddhaghosa, the mind that hasn't cultivated mindfulness is said to be like something light floating on the surface of the water, maybe a feather. It will float away. It's so light that that feather, if it's just resting on top of the water, will float away. And mindfulness is seen to be like a stone. A stone doesn't float away. Rather, it remains anchored in place. And also, another quality of mindfulness, if we consider this metaphor, this image of mindfulness being a stone, that stone penetrates deeply and doesn't just remain on the surface. Mindfulness helps to develop both shamatha, or stopping or serenity, and insight, which, as Tay has often reminded us, are the two wings of a bird. They have to go together. There's a common misperception that we hear often, that the Buddha taught mindfulness. The Buddha didn't just teach mindfulness. The Buddha taught right mindfulness, sammasati. The Buddha taught us to cultivate this quality of right mindfulness, attentiveness to what generates and nurtures wholesome qualities in ourselves and in others. In fact, the Buddha taught, in terms of mindfulness and right mindfulness, the Buddha taught yoniso manasikara, the capacity to develop appropriate attention. Mindfulness is not a feeling. Rather, mindfulness, this faculty of mind, has a balancing quality. And it's the basis, it's considered to be the basis for all of the other wholesome qualities that we can imagine to arise. And in fact, it's considered to be the most important quality in developing any wholesome or beneficial qualities in our consciousness. In fact, in Buddhism, it's said if we cultivate right mindfulness, all things related to the path will manifest from there. And we see, especially in the Plum Village tradition, because of this understanding of the primacy and the importance of developing right mindfulness, that developing this capacity of mindfulness is emphasized incredibly strongly. Mindfulness while walking, mindfulness while breathing, mindfulness while opening the door, while walking to the car, while cooking our breakfast. bringing that same mind to everything that we do. As a factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, we concretely cultivate right mindfulness through the practice of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. Mindfulness of the body in the body, mindfulness of the feelings in the feelings, mindfulness of the mind in the mind, and mindfulness of objects of mind in objects of mind, or it can also be translated as dhammas in the dhammas. As the Buddha explains in the sutras, he says, and what, friends, is right mindfulness? Herein, a practitioner dwells contemplating the body in the body. Ardent. Ardent means fired up or enthusiastic. Clearly comprehending and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief concerning the world. They dwell contemplating feelings in feelings, states of mind from within the states of mind. Dhammas in dhammas. Ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having put away all attachment and distaste concerning the world. In fact, the Buddha said that the 4 foundations of mindfulness form the only way, or the one way, that leads to the attainment of freedom, to transforming our suffering, to entering upon and walking upon the Noble Eightfold Path, or the right path, and realizing freedom, or transforming our suffering. The 4 establishments are called the one way, Ekka no Mago, because in Buddhism, liberation can only come about by looking deeply at your own experience through developing right mindfulness in these 4 areas. When we speak about the one way, I'm reminded of it's actually a true story. It's quite touching in a way. It happened in Santa Ana, where there's a large immigrant community, a large community that speaks mainly Vietnamese. And the Venerable Thukden, who is living with us in Deer Park, he came back to Deer Park, and he shared with us that after one of his teachings, he overheard 2 of the practitioners who'd come to listen to his talk sharing with each other. And one practitioner was asking the other practitioner, "Where do you live? What's the name of your street?" And the person responded, "I live on One Way Street." And the Venerable laughed, because the person thought that the sign that said One Way Street was the name of the street, and not just like a notification for everybody. So in Buddhism, the 4 establishments are really the one-way street. They're the way to be able to walk solidly on the Noble Eightfold Path, and to be able to cultivate properly and fully the quality of right mindfulness. If we look in a general way at the 4 establishments, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, then the contemplation of the body is concerned with the physical aspects of our life. And the other 3 foundations of mindfulness are concerned a little more with the mental side. Although please remember that nothing can exist by itself alone. Everything's interconnected. There's no fixed order of developing the 4 establishments, although mindfulness of the body in the body is, just like is said in The Sound of Music, a very good place to start, since it's very concrete and it's the easiest to focus on in the beginning stages of developing mindfulness. So let's have a quick look at each of the foundations. For a deeper look, I recommend Tay's wonderful book, Transformation and Healing. And I also recommend Venerable Analayo's books on Satipatthana. I honestly think that we could spend months exploring each of the 4 establishments, and we might just do that. But for now, please see these as just very general introductions to each of the four foundations. The first of the four foundations is contemplation of the body in the body. Within this section of meditation instructions in the Sutra of the Four Establishments of Mindfulness, there are the following exercises to do with the body. There's the instruction on mindfulness of breathing. There's the instruction on extending this quality of attentiveness to all of our postures and actions. That once we've established this attentiveness, that we carry this same energy throughout the day. There's the reflections on the 32 parts of the body. There's the reflections on the elements which are in the body, and also, of course, in the world around. Earth, water, fire, and air. There are the cemetery contemplations, or the so-called charnel ground contemplations. And then from there, looking deeply into the body and having awareness of the process of coming to be and passing away with regard to the body. In the Satipatthana Sutra itself, the discourse on the four establishments of mindfulness, the Buddha shares that we begin cultivating awareness of the body in the body with developing the practice of anapanasati, or mindfulness of breathing. Anapanasati, as many will know, is one of the main practices, the main meditation practices taught in the Plum Village tradition, and it consists of 16 exercises. In taking up mindfulness of breathing, we'll find that it serves as a foundation for our entire meditative development. If we allow the practice of anapanasati to ripen, then it will lead us onwards from awareness of body to feelings, to our mind, and then to all things. It's not just a practice for beginners, not something that we do for a while, then tick off and move on to more advanced practices. Mindfulness of breathing is in itself one of the most advanced practices. As I've shared before, one of the characteristics of any Buddhist practice, when applied correctly, is that it has the quality of leading us onward. By itself, to use the example of mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of breathing will lead to all stages of the path. It will carry us all the way, and it embraces all the aspects of Buddhist practice. In fact, it was this very practice that the Buddha practiced throughout his life. And he would return to this practice over and over again throughout his life, and recommended it to practitioners. And he praised it as being peaceful and sublime, a blissful abiding, which stops and stills unhelpful thoughts as soon as they arise. Mindfulness of breathing is a very effective meditation subject because it works with bringing awareness to a process that's already available for us, and that's our breathing. The meditation itself, believe it or not, is not that demanding. It just invites us to open an awareness of the breath as it is, without changing it in any way. The awareness of breath cuts through our usual layers of discursive thinking, our layers of interpretations and questions and lists of things to do, and it grounds us fully in the here and the now. For whenever we become aware of the experience of breathing, we can only be aware of it in the now, not in the past or in the future. It's something that is only available to us in the immediate present. Developing mindfulness of breathing is a beautiful process, and it's also a natural process that will unfold in and of itself. if we engage a sense of attentiveness, mindfulness, and curiosity to our breath, perhaps noting the rising of our abdomen, the falling of our abdomen, or the breath at the tip of the nose, the back of our throat, or perhaps following the length of our breath all the way in, all the way out. Then after some time of simply noting the in-breath and out-breath in that way, engaging that sense of curiosity, we begin to notice, without anybody necessarily telling us what the next step of the traditional 16 exercises are, we notice by ourselves, oh, this breath is a little bit different than the one before. Some of my breaths are long, some of my breaths are short. Then slowly we become aware of the entire flow of the breath throughout our body as we breathe in and we breathe out. And slowly a sense of calm and ease emerges. And then we become aware of feelings, we become aware of mental formations and all these kind of things. Mindfulness of breathing leads us in that direction. This is the natural process that will unfold if we apply the practice correctly, even in very simple ways in the initial stages. Beyond these first few steps of mindfulness of breathing that unfold naturally that I just shared, there's more advanced practices which develop mindfulness of breathing towards more subtle things, or awareness of breathing towards more subtle things. But again, let me let you in on a secret. The most advanced practices are the very quote unquote beginning practices. They will bring you right back to the beginning, right back to the point at which we started. It's the very beginning that is supreme. It's the beginning that's the culmination of the path. Let's have a sound of the bell. The next, another practice in the Satipatthana Sutta and the discourse on the four establishments of mindfulness with regard to awareness of the body in the body is the contemplation of our physical postures. Our body can take four basic postures: sitting, walking, standing, and lying down, and a variety of other postures that are made up of combinations of those four basic postures. Mindfulness of the postures of our body, focus full attention on our body in whatever position we are. When we're walking, we're aware that we're walking. When we're standing, we're aware that we're standing. When we're sitting, we're aware that we're sitting. And when we're lying down, we're aware that we're lying down. And if we're changing postures, if we're in those moments of transition, we bring awareness to those moments as well. Mindfulness of the postures of the body prepare us for the next phase of awareness of the body and the body that's mentioned in the sutra, and that is mindfulness and clear comprehension. And this adds another layer onto the recognition and bare awareness of the postures. And that other layer is an element of understanding. We're told in the sutra that whenever we're walking, sitting, standing, or lying down, or doing anything at all, we perform it with full awareness and clear comprehension. I just know what you're asking. What does it mean when we say full awareness and clear comprehension? So for those of you who are asking that question, you'll be very pleased to know that in the commentaries, clear comprehension is explained in a lot of detail. And as I've shared quite openly, I'm a list lover. And so this is for all of the Dharma list lovers out there as well. Clear comprehension in this practice is considered to have 4 aspects. The first is understanding the purpose of the action. In other words, why we're doing something. If we're walking somewhere, why are we walking? The second is understanding its suitability. In other words, do I really need to be doing this thing right now? The third is being able to adjust the focus of your meditation to properly incorporate all aspects of this action without getting distracted. This is actually quite a subtle practice. I like to compare it to the zoom in and zoom out function of a camera, or whether it's a picture camera or a video camera. That as meditators, we have to have those 2 capacities that a camera lens has to be able to zoom right in to a micro sensation, such as the sensation of the breath touching the tip of our nose or something like that, or a sensation in the body, and to be able to zoom out and be aware of everything else that's happening in the room and the other things that are taking place. If we develop only one of those capacities, then we will have some challenges. If we only develop the capacity to zoom right in, you will not really be able to get many things done in your day. But if you only have the capacity to remain in a zoomed out state, then it's quite challenging to be able to look very deeply or penetrate deeply into something. So to have those 2 skills and to know when and how to apply them both is really important. And this is what's being spoken of here. To be able to have the capacity, to be able to have developed the capacity to zoom in on a sensation, to establish our mindfulness firmly in a subtle way, but also to be able to zoom out and to be aware of the whole experience while maintaining the same sense of presence. So our awareness expands and is able to contract a little. The fourth is understanding without delusion, like understanding and seeing clearly without delusion. This is the 4th aspect of clear comprehension. And we'll delve into this last aspect of clear comprehension a little later. So the next 2 sections on mindfulness of the body in the body offer us contemplations on the body that help us to begin to see aspects of our body's true nature. One of these is the meditation on the 32 parts of the body, the hair of the head, the nails, the teeth, the skin, the hair on our body, and so on. It's designed to help us to see and experience the reality of impermanence. And the other meditation in this section is a contemplation on the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, as they come together to make up this body. With the meditation on the elements, we've actually done aspects of this meditation in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha. And those meditations provide a framework for the contemplation of our body into the 4 primary elements, which we refer to by the names of earth, water, fire, and air. But they actually, rather than just elements in an abstract sense, they're actually referring to the 4 main behaviors of matter, which are solidity, fluidity, heat, and movement. So earth, for example, refers to solidity. And then the water element refers to fluidity or the flowing nature of things. Fire, of course, refers to heat. And that's a very interesting meditation when you become aware through your mindful in-breath and out-breath of the experience of heat and coolness in your body. And then air refers to movement of the body. So the solid aspect, the earth element of our body, is most clearly seen in the solid parts. For example, the organs, the tissues, the bones, the fluid element, of course, in the fluid aspects, and the heat element in the temperature, and the air element or the movement element in the process of breathing, or in the movements that our body makes constantly. So after touching these aspects within our own being, we widen our perspective. Again, this zooming in and then zooming out capacity. And we contemplate these elements or the behaviors of these elements in the world around us. And over time, we start to understand on a deep level that perhaps the idea of what constitutes the Holy Trinity of I, me, and my might just be a little bit too small. The final exercise mentioned in the sutra of practices related to the establishing of mindfulness of the body in the body is a series of cemetery contemplations. These are contemplations of our own body's disintegration after death. And we can perform this as a visualization. I'll actually never forget one year in Deer Park Monastery, where when we used to have weekend retreats for college-age students. There are a number of colleges that used to participate and the professors would bring their students down for a weekend at Deer Park Monastery. So they would often arrive in time for our afternoon sitting and sutra recitation. And there was one time that we were up to the cemetery contemplations in the Satipatthana Sutra, the Discourse on the Four Establishments of Mindfulness. So these young college students, for their first experience ever of being in a monastery, had just done sitting meditation. And then they were hearing the monks read a text about seeing my body as a corpse, bloated, and so on. The students had looks on their faces, and I guess they were wondering what on earth they got themselves into. So we contemplate our body, our own body, as a corpse, and going through the stages of disintegration, considering things like this body, which now seems so full of life, has the same nature and is subject to the same fate. This is going to happen. It will happen for sure. We cannot escape death. We can't escape disintegration, but we will die, and our body will decompose. It will become other things. It might become flowers or trees or grass. And in fact, death or disintegration is not something that only happens in the future, but it's happening right now. Those of us who are getting older definitely can relate to this. It's happening right now. Again, please don't misunderstand the purpose of this meditation. Buddhist monastics are not all goths with a morbid fascination on death and corpses. But we practice this meditation in order to weaken our clinging, our holding on, our identification with this body in a way, and to acknowledge our death. And in order to weaken this sense of clinging, of identifying only with, this body as me, as the I, me, and my, then the Buddha proposed some pretty strong medicine, just like in the Four Nutriments. The meditation on our own body as a corpse is pretty strong medicine. Our tendency to want to cling on to things comes about because we have this deeply rooted assumption that everything is permanent. So this contemplation helps us, first of all, to be able to conceptualize our own death, but then to be able to experience this process of change that's taking place, this process of disintegration, of dissolution that's taking place even now. And that's not something that is necessarily sad. It's just part of the way things are. It's part of the reality of life. And so this meditation, when done correctly, doesn't make us want to dress in black, wearing hats and sunglasses and sit in darkness all day and feel depressed and sigh. But actually it brings about a sense of joy, a sense of celebration, which seems kind of odd to many of us when we consider the nature of this meditation, but that's the quality that it gives rise to. The next of the 4 establishments of mindfulness, which are the foundation for developing right mindfulness in context of the Noble Eightfold Path, is contemplation of the feeling in the feeling. Basically, the Pali term Vedana refers to sensations or feelings that are aroused by perception. Or more specifically, when a sense base, and a sense base you'll remember from earlier Dharma talks are our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, and so on. Our sense base and sense consciousness associated with those sense bases, like our eyes have eye consciousness, our nose has nose consciousness, and our mouth has mouth consciousness, and so on, comes into contact with a stimulus, which we call a sense object. For example, our mouth comes in contact with a taste, or our nose and nose consciousness comes in contact with a smell or a fragrance. So whenever we come into contact with a stimulus, there's a feeling that arises every single time. This feeling might be strong or indistinct, and it depends on the strength of the contact, the strength of the taste, the strength of the smell, the strength of the physical sensation, and so on. The word feeling is used here in this establishment of mindfulness, not in the sense of emotion, which is a more complex formation, but in the narrower sense of the basic shade of feeling arising when we come into contact with a stimulus. Feeling is a little bit more in the next establishment. Emotion is a little bit more in the next establishment, which we will speak about in a moment. Every act of perceiving, of contact, phassa, which we spoke about in the series on the nutriments, every perception of a contact, a phassa, between a sense object and a sense base carries with it a tone of feeling, which is highly individual, pleasant, painful, or neither, kind of a neutral sense. In Buddhist psychology, we describe 3 basic shades of feeling, which are, of course, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. If you've studied dependent origination, or you've participated in the earlier series on the 4 nutriments, you'll recall that feeling arises in dependence on a contact. Contact marks the coming together of consciousness with a sense object, such as a sound, a smell, a taste, a touch, and so on. And as an establishment of mindfulness, developing awareness of feeling as an object of contemplation is essential, because it's often the feeling tone that waters the unhelpful roots in our consciousness. This is an almost automatic process for most people. By noting the shade of feeling when we notice a sense impression, pleasant, painful, or neutral, or pleasant, unpleasant, or neither, then we begin to recognize, interrupt, and redirect this process. For example, when a pleasant feeling arises, we might find that the root of greed or this thirst is watered, and we cling to it. When a painful feeling occurs, we might respond with aspects of aversion or ill will, turning away, closing down. And if a neutral shade of feeling arises, then we might not notice it, or we might just be feeling somewhat blank or a sense of complacency. And this would be perhaps a manifestation of the root of delusion. So each of the 3 roots, the root of greed, the root of ill will, and the root of delusion, which we've explored in some detail in previous talks, they're watered and nourished by a particular kind of feeling. Greed is nourished by what? By pleasant feeling. It has the tendency to water that if we haven't begun to recognize and interrupt that process. It's possible to redirect it so that pleasant experiences nurture other qualities, other wholesome roots within us. But for most of us, without awareness, the root of greed, the root of always thinking that we lack something, will be nurtured by the feeling tone of this pleasant feeling tone, or ill will or aversion is nurtured by this sense of unpleasant feeling tone. And then delusion is nurtured and strengthened by the neutral tone. But the link between the feelings and these roots is not absolute. And particularly as we develop, as I just mentioned, our mindfulness and our sensitivity. So feeling will water an unhelpful root only when it's not noticed. When we just let everything run its automatic course, rather than recognizing and interrupting the process or redirecting the process a little. By this natural factor of recognition, mindfulness interrupts the automatic process that waters an unhelpful response. Then instead of relating to the feeling by way of our well-worn habitual responses or habit energies, it becomes a contemplation. And we use the shade of feeling, this feeling tone, as a basis for understanding our experience. In its section on mindfulness of feeling, as an establishment of mindfulness, the discourse on the 4 establishments of mindfulness mentions 2 practices. The first is understanding feelings as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant, in other words, neutral feelings. And the second set of practices, remaining focused on feelings in themselves, or as was in a similar way for the first establishment of mindfulness, having clear awareness of the arising and passing away of feeling or feeling tones as they arise and pass away. So in the initial stages of our practice, the contemplation of feeling in feeling as an establishment of mindfulness involves recognizing and noting the distinctive qualities of the shades of feeling, pleasant, painful, or neutral, as they present themselves. We recognize, but we don't identify ourselves with it. We don't get too caught up in the whole story. We notice if we attach to one of those holy trinities of I, me, and my. We remain at the level of bare attention, of simply noticing, this is pleasant, or this is not so pleasant, or I feel kind of a blankness about this. Our practice here is simply to note the feeling's quality, its tone of pleasure, pain, or the neutral kind of tone. But as our practice continues, and we've become more skillful with noting, becoming aware of each feeling tone, of letting it go and noting the next one as it arises, the focus of our attention shifts naturally from the qualities of the feeling, this feeling tone, to the process of feeling itself. As we begin to notice the process, we become aware that in fact, feeling is a whole series of events that occur in very quick succession. And we begin to develop an insight into impermanence on an experiential level. And that begins to weaken these roots of thirst, of greed, of thinking that we lack something, of ill will towards ourselves and to others, and of delusion, of not seeing things clearly. There's less and less hunger, thirst, or greed for pleasant feelings, less ill will and shutting down and aversion if something unpleasant is happening, and less blankness, confusion, and delusion over neutral feelings. We begin to see things over time more clearly. Let's have a sound of the bell. Tay, our teacher, always reminded us that mindfulness needs to be concrete. And in terms of the Noble Eightfold Path, right mindfulness is definitely made concrete through practicing the 4 establishments of mindfulness. The third of the 4 establishments of mindfulness is contemplation of the mind in the mind. So with this foundation of mindfulness, we turn from a particular mental factor, which is feeling, to a more broad awareness of mind, or as it's called in Buddhism, citta. Excuse me. As a basic introduction for this foundation of mindfulness, it might be helpful to understand that in Buddhism, mind is not considered as a faculty that remains the same throughout all of our experiences. It doesn't remain the same, but it's constantly in a state of growth, of change, of development, and it has to be said, decay. There are many metaphors for mind or for citta in Buddhism. One is a garden with many seeds, which we love to use in Plum Village. And another is like a river, with the sense that mind or consciousness is constantly in a state of flow or change, just like a river flows onwards. In Buddhist psychology, mind is regarded not as a lasting subject of thought, feeling, or volition or intentionality, but as a sequence of arisings. And we speak about this in Plum Village as seeds being watered, arising, remaining in mind consciousness for some time and sinking down. But we can also see it in terms of a flow of a river. In the context of this talk, which is covering each of the establishments in a very brief way, I'd like to mention that in this foundation of mindfulness, we find it helpful to focus on citta samskara, the mental formations, as a way of becoming aware of mind in the mind. A formation is a technical term in Buddhism that basically means something that is made of something else. According to the Vijnanavada school of Buddhism, to which we belong, there are 51 mental formations. And they're divided into universals, factors that are always present in any mental formation, such as contact. And we've just spoken about contact in the last establishment, the contact between sense consciousness, sense base, and sense object. That moment when a smell reaches us and we have that moment of contact. And then there's attention. So there's contact, but then you become attentive to it. You notice the smell of a rose. If you don't notice it, it's still there perhaps, but you haven't noticed it. It hasn't been strong enough. So it hasn't created this attention in you. And then there's feeling. There's a feeling tone. For some of you, the smell of a rose might be a delightful fragrance. And you have the feeling tone of, oh, it's a pleasant smell. For some of you, because of perhaps some past experiences or associations, or maybe even allergies, it may not be so pleasant. So there's contact, attention, feeling tone. Then there's perception and volition. So there's a kind of moving forward. There's some kind of motivation that comes about. So those are the universals. That are present in any mental formation. And then there are particular mental formations such as determination, mindfulness, and so on. There's wholesome mental formations such as confidence, diligence, energy, and so on. There's unwholesome mental formations such as anger, jealousy, malice, and so on. And then there's indeterminate mental formations, which means they could be beneficial or not yet beneficial depending on the situation. A couple of examples of indeterminate mental formations are initial and sustained thought. it depends on what you're thinking about, whether it's beneficial or not. You can find a full list of the 51 mental formations on the Plum Village website. It's a really helpful resource to have, and so it's freely available there. And I really recommend having a look at that sheet. So one way of developing this framework is to sharpen our awareness a little further from the previous establishment or foundation of mindfulness, where we recognize in a more simple way the feeling tone, and cultivate the capacity to recognize each mental formation as it arises and call it by its true name. Hello, happiness. I know you're there. And from there, we contemplate what factors led to its arising. And then we apply the 4 right efforts, as we discussed last week, depending on which mental formation is arising. In the discourse on the 4 establishments of mindfulness, the Buddha proposed the following concrete practice. He recommended that we focus our attention on the presence and absence of the 3 basic unwholesome roots: the root of greed, the root of ill will, and the root of delusion in each mental formation. And to also notice the following qualities of mind. Again, Buddhist list lovers, this is a special treat for you. I've had a lot of fun with this list. It's a good one. There are 16 kinds of citta, or aspects of mind, to be aware of in this awareness. The mind with greed. When we hear greed in Buddhist psychology, again, we're thinking about that mind that's always searching for something, that thinks that we lack something. The mind without without that tendency, a mind with ill will or aversion. The mind without ill will and aversion. The mind with delusion, the mind without delusion. The cramped mind, the scattered mind, the developed mind, the undeveloped mind, the surpassable mind and the unsurpassable mind, the concentrated mind, the unconcentrated mind, the freed mind, and the unfreed mind. It's quite a list. So it's quite a lot for us to cultivate when we devote our attention to cultivating this 3rd foundation of mindfulness. So basically, we focus on these frames of mind, these mental formations as they're arising in this 3rd establishment of mindfulness, from the feeling tone, where we've moved on to mental formations such as happiness, sadness, anger, and so on, which are mental formations in Buddhist psychology. And we notice, when we notice these mental formations arising, whether they're associated with any of those unhelpful roots or not. They might actually be associated with some of the wholesome roots. When we notice that a state of mind or a mental formation is present, we don't call it I or mine or me. It just is. It's arisen for various reasons, and sooner or later, it will pass away. Whether it's a beneficial state of mind or a yet to become beneficial state of mind, we practice to simply recognize and not to become too dejected if we notice an unhelpful mind state or mental formation. As I said last week, I think if we notice an unhelpful mind state, rather than feeling dejected, we should actually congratulate ourselves because we've recognized it. This is a great sign. And not only have we recognized it, but thanks to coming into contact with these teachings of Buddhism, we have concrete tools to be able to take good care of it, to learn with it, to be able to transform that energy from something that's unhelpful into something that is helpful and wise and kind. And also remember, in practicing this establishment of mindfulness, when you notice an unhelpful mental formation, please remember that we're all human. as our contemplation of this factor develops, we watch the process of becoming, how something comes to be, or bhava, which we've spoken about in other talks, this quality of becoming, always moving forward as it manifests in our mind. Over time, by practicing right mindfulness, we have a recognition emerge. We're not a separate observer of our experience. We are the very experience, the mental formation itself. And then the fourth establishment of mindfulness, very briefly, is contemplation of objects of mind in objects of mind, or phenomena, or dhammas. The same word can be translated in many different ways. So as we continue to look at the establishments of mindfulness and we move on to this fourth establishment, we see the word dhamma, contemplation of dhammas. Dhamma with a capital D, which, by the way, I think is a great book title. It means the teachings and insights of Buddhism. So whenever we see Dhamma with a capital D, it's the teachings of Buddhism. Dhamma here in this foundation of mindfulness is Dhamma with a small d, and it means phenomena. In this foundation, we actually see Dhamma not only with a small d, but it's in the plural as dhammas. And so it means all phenomena, because that's the best we can do in English at this moment in time. So to put it very simply as we can, the contemplation of dhammas means to contemplate phenomena as they present themselves to us. On one level, contemplating the outer stimulus that gave rise to a mental formation, for example. For example, anger always has a cause, no matter how subtle. So does happiness, and so does awakening. On another level, in this sutra, the section on the contemplation of phenomena is, as I'm sure you will guess, divided into 5 subsections, and each is devoted to a different set of dhammas with a small d. But what will be reassuring to you is that many of these we have already explored together in some of our series of teachings. So these will be very familiar to you, and I'm sure you're already well practiced in recognizing these things. The 5 hindrances, the 5 skandhas, the sense bases, whether they're inner sense bases or outer sense bases, the 7 factors of awakening, and the 4 noble truths. And among these lists of things, the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening are dhammas or phenomena in the sense of mental factors, factors of consciousness. And the others, the 5 aggregates, the sense bases, and so on, are dhammas in the broader sense of being components of our embodied experience. So to keep it easy, in this talk, we'll focus mainly on the 2 groups that we see as dhamma in the sense of mental factors, since we'll be covering some of the other ones when we explore the 4 noble truths. So we already touched on both of these briefly in earlier series of talks for the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, but today let's look at them in connection with our practice of right mindfulness. The other aspects mentioned in the sutra are the 5 skandhas, the 4 noble truths, and so on, and we'll look into them later. The 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening, which we explored earlier, are incredibly important areas to direct our attention to cultivate mindfulness of, because they're the very ground of practice. The principal challenges, and at the same time, the principal supports for our individual and collective liberation. Very soon after beginning to meditate or to cultivate mindfulness, we usually begin to notice the hindrances, sensual desire, ill will, dullness and drowsiness, restlessness and worry, and skeptical doubt. And then we usually have the tendency to think that there's something going wrong. There's something wrong with our practice, that we're meditationally dysfunctional or something, or maybe that we're really practicing incorrectly. Many people come to Dharma teachers for consultations about these issues when they're in the initial stages of the practice. And let me just say for now, not because I'm lazy to give consultations, and neither are all the other amazing Dharma teachers, but as a word of encouragement for those of us who are new to the practice, recognizing these things is a great sign of progress. After the initial beginning phase, when we begin noticing these hindrances arise, I think we should actually be really happy when we notice these things arising. Not necessarily because it's a great thing to have these things arising, but it's a great thing to recognize them, because now the ground of practice, the very field of our practice, has appeared for us. In the initial stages of practice, we don't even see these things. We don't recognize them, but now the very ground of our practice has appeared. Whenever one of the hindrances, such as ill will or restlessness or so on, arises, we note it. And then when it fades away, we also recognize that. Breathing in, for example, ill will or anger is present in me. Or when it's not present, breathing in, breathing out, I recognize anger is not present in me. In order to practice effectively with the hindrances and transform them, over time, we have to begin understanding from our own experience how these hindrances arise within us. And then what practices help us to be able to transform them, and how we can not water them in the future, as we discussed last week. In addition to mindfulness, this also requires some curiosity and some experimentation. And we approach the 7 factors of awakening in the same way: mindfulness, investigation, energy, bliss, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. We notice when any one of these factors is arising, whenever we're experiencing any of them. And then after noting it, we explore and we investigate in order to discover how it came to be, and how we can ripen it, and how we can bring it to full fruition. When they first spring up in our consciousness, in our experience, these factors might not be very strong, but with repeated nurturing, they will grow. Everything begins and ends with mindfulness. And mindfulness is the first cause that, when it ripens, will bring about all the other factors: investigation, energy, bliss, and so on. In this way, the whole of our spiritual life, the whole of our practice begins and is really guided by and shaped by mindfulness. And the right way to apply and practice mindfulness is through cultivating the concrete practices of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. So dear beloved community, I hope that this talk this evening has been helpful for all of you. It's certainly been a delight to share with you. I hope that you found something useful to be able to apply in your practice. I'm looking forward to hearing how everybody concretely works through the practices of awareness of the body in the body, feeling in the feeling, mind in the mind, and phenomena in phenomena. So I wish everybody a beautiful and wonderful week of practice.